Okay. Okay. Hi, my name is Kim Weeks. I'd like to welcome you back, or welcome you to these Weeks Well events that we're doing in 2022 that are an outgrowth of the Yoga Lineages project that I started last year with Yoga Alliance. In this series, which is now in its second year, I'm talking with the world's main modern global lineage heads or longtime practitioners from all different corners of the practice to talk about what yoga lineage is and why it matters. And, I have to say that today, for so many reasons, is such a special day. First of all, happy International Yoga Day to everybody. Secondly, I know. Secondly, happy solstice for those of us who practice. Yeah. And then happy birthday to Stephen Cope.
Thank you.
And so I'm here to have this session go on with you all on the, what yoga lineage is and why it matters from the point of view of two practitioners who have a long history together. And with Sat Bir and me, I have history with. I've certainly been talking to Stephen for over a year now about this project. And so I'm so, Stephen, delighted to welcome you and for us to be together in this Sangha, in this conversation, and in the exploration of, at a time when, as we discussed, Stephen and Sat Bir in our pre-call, there's been such a kind of a mainstreaming of yoga. What happens to lineage? What happens to the threads of lineage in that context? So most of you know or know of Sat Bir Singh Khalsa, who's now an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. And as I read in your book, Stephen, you said it well. I think you said he's the heart and the soul, or the main driver behind yoga research in the world. And I'm always seeking for ways to say it, but it's totally true. So without any further ado as well, welcome Stephen Cope, who's here, a multiple times published author and a Kripalu yoga teacher. And I'm sure you two will talk about how you met and the work you did together, which you can learn about in part by reading Stephen's recent book, The Dharma of Difficult Times, in Difficult Times, right? Yeah, I'm even curious about that preposition, like of or in. Anyway, The Dharma in Difficult Times, it is such a good book, and Stephen outdoes himself even here. But you can read about the work that they did together, some research that they intersected in, which is one of the things we'll talk about today. Yeah. So quick housekeeping before I hand it over to Stephen by asking my first questions. First of all, this is a 75-minute call, and we kind of riff in these conversations. Stephen and Sat Bir, as we both, all three of us have discussed, and as many of you logging in have learned, we could be here all day talking about this topic. And if you do have questions, please feel free to go to the Q&A, which is for you. You can upvote questions if you see them, ones that you like. And the chat function is from us to you, where we'll share links, for example, Stephen's book, Sat Bir's book. I mean, we've got, you've got some heavy hitters on this call, which is why I'm so honored to be a part of it. So keep looking for the chat for information on us and on Stephen and Sat Bir. And right as we get started, I'm going to ask just two questions that'll pop up on your screen. First, I think our first question is, are you a yoga teacher? We're curious. You all will probably laugh, Stephen and Sat Bir. We asked last time, are you a yoga teacher, a yoga practitioner, or both? And Lois Steinberg, in all of her very, sort of succinct wisdom, was like, how can you be a yoga teacher without being a yoga practitioner? So we thought that's true. So the second question is, how did you hear about this event from us? Did you hear about it from, Stephen's or Sat Bir's newsletters or outreach, or did you hear about it some other way, social media or some other way? So as you're answering the question, we will then get started. There are so many things to talk about, Stephen and Sat Bir, and we decided to start at the very top, which is the pros and cons of lineage. And you all met at Kripalu, is that right?
We did. I mean, my memory of this goes back many decades now, I'm so happy to say, but my memory is that we had met briefly at Kripalu, but we met in depth at the dinner that was the launch for the Harvard Institute of Oriental Medicine. And we were both there as guests, and somehow, I don't know if we were at the same table, but I just remember, Sat Bir, that we ended up in a corner talking about what we needed to do in order to really birth yoga into the mainstream. And we decided at that wonderful event, cloistered away in a corner, that in order to mainstream yoga, we really had to have the science. We had to really understand the mechanisms and effects and dosing and all of the things that Sat Bir has dedicated his life to, in order to bring it into mainstream institutions, schools, universities, medical centers. Well, that was, I believe, in 2006, and we pretty much hit the ground running by enrolling the Boston Symphony Orchestra, a major mainstream institution, in the idea of bringing us into their summer program for great young musicians around the world, and studying the effects of curriculum of yoga and meditation on performance. Because I'm a classical pianist, and I have no doubt that when I'm practicing meditation and yoga deeply, it transforms my musicianship, my practice, my consciousness of the music. We had, at Kripalu, we had 2 big old grand pianos down in the basement. So when I arrived there, I started noticing that with my deeper practice, my concentration was heightened, my memory was heightened, my capacity to do what's called sight reading, that is to just read from a very complex script. And so I got really interested in that. I knew that wasn't just me. And so Tanglewood, the great summer home of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, is right across the street from Kripalu. And we found that because we approached them with the idea of doing research, they, even though I think 20 years ago it was still considered a little bit marginal, they invited us in, and we had 3 wonderful summers. Sat Bir and I were on the faculty of Tanglewood Institute, and did some great research and had some great experiences with these exceptional young kids. Sat Bir, what do you remember about our first meeting?
Well, it was 2005.
Okay.
It was a new Harvard program in Asian medicine, started by Ted Kapchuk, who is well known for his research in placebo effects and acupuncture. And so, yeah, that was an opening event, and we hit it off right away with a lot of conversation at that event, and then immediately followed up with that. And it was Kavi's inspiration and initiative to take this in the direction of yoga for musicians. And the one thing we found pretty quickly in the research was it's pretty difficult to measure creativity and performance characteristics. That's difficult to measure, but the one thing we found right away, and one thing that was very important and critical actually for musicians, was music performance anxiety. And so that ended up being the primary outcome for the research that we did over the next 5 years or so. And it went beyond Tanglewood. We ended up in Boston as well, at the Boston Conservatory, doing a study there. And we were writing grant applications, and we published a number of papers really showing fairly nicely that music performance anxiety was reduced in these young adult musicians. We also did studies with the Tanglewood program with adolescent musicians, and that also revealed positive results. And the problem for musicians is that where do they go if they have anxiety? I mean, you can't start taking mind-altering drugs like benzodiazepines, because that's going to, I mean, these are brain drugs. And music performance is a very subtle, central nervous system function. You have to be very tuned in, very subtle, and drugs are, they end up with side effects and so on. So anxiety drugs are not really an option for musicians. Furthermore, this is absolutely a critical issue for musicians. If you want to become a musician if you can't manage your music performance anxiety, you cannot have a career. So this is really absolutely critical for them. And so what we ended up looking at was something that was very important, and published a few studies that really showed that efficacy.
We also had another effect, Sat Bir. Oh, by the way, when Sat Bir says Kavi, my Sanskrit name is Kaviraj, so my shorter name is Kavi. We had a resilience effect. So keep in mind that the students we were studying at Tanglewood were embedded in an incredibly stressful 8 to 10 week summer program that's kind of like medical school for musicians. And what we found was that the control group really deteriorated on many factors over the course of the 8 to 10 weeks, whereas the group that we administered yoga and meditation to really very much held their own. So there was an interesting resilience factor there. And then we had lots of anecdotal evidence that the students, for example, the students who were playing in ensembles felt this heightened sense of connectivity to their peers. I was teaching, meanwhile, Sat Bir was doing the hard research. I was teaching them the Bhagavad Gita all 3 summers. And one of the main places they had struggles was with, regarding the Gita, I say there are 4 pillars: discern your Dharma, do it full out, let go of the fruits, and turn it over to God or to something greater than yourself. So this whole idea of letting go, of grasping to the outcome in performance was initially a huge stumbling block for them. But then it turned out to be freedom, because Sat Bir and I found that these kids, and I say kids, they're 20 to 26 years old, had so much grasping and clinging to outcome and to perfectionism. And they didn't understand that that kind of grasping actually interferes with performance. So by the end of each summer, we had these gala dinners, and we had the kids, they were playing and they were letting go of their grasping to outcome, and they were having amazing outcomes as a result of that one step from the Gita.
So go ahead.
Following up on that, the other thing about connectivity is that, there is this state which is essentially similar to the samadhi state, which is called the flow state. And there was a questionnaire that measures that flow experience. And so for some of the years, we actually applied the flow questionnaire. And what we found, in fact, was that the scores on the flow for the kids that were doing, or the young adults that were doing the yoga, increased. And one of the subscales of that flow questionnaire is called the autotelic state. And autotelic is referring to that unitive state of consciousness. And that was also increased. So it's really remarkable to be able to measure that kind of a flow state after just 6 weeks of the yoga practice.
Sat Bir, are you referring there to the 5-factor mindfulness questionnaire?
No, this was the flow questionnaire.
Flow questionnaire.
This is this whole construct of flow that Csikszentmihalyi developed and has become a whole field in and of itself.
Can we talk about that really briefly? Because I've heard you. So for those on the call, Sat Bir and I did about 60 or 70 webinars during lockdown and beyond on the scientific research on yoga. And Sat Bir presented on this exact information at least once, if not more than once. I feel like it was maybe twice or 3 times as subsets of like other topics he was addressing, but specifically when we were talking about yoga as transformation, or yoga as transcendental work, basically, that one of those last ones. So you talked about that questionnaire in that presentation. Can you explain it a little bit for the listeners today?
Sure. I think we might have covered it in one of the talks, one of the webinars on anxiety, and the other webinar on spirituality.
Right.
And the flow state is really, it occurs during an activity, and during that activity, so like for musicians, there's a sense of merger. There's a sense of being absorbed by the whole process. There's no distinction in that flow experience between the musician, the instrument, and the music. It is all indistinguishable. That's why it's called flow. It's just this flow state. And really, when you look at the definition of it and the experience of it and the description of it, it really is this mystical state of consciousness, this unitive absorptive state. So really, and many musicians experience that, especially accomplished musicians. And it's what gives musicians the real passion for what they do, because that experience is to die for, obviously. It is such a deep and powerful experience.
Mhm.
And I'm sorry, Kim.
Oh, please.
And it's exactly what's described in the Yoga Sutra and is known as dhyan, which is often described as the kind of powerful concentration in which awareness and attention is flowing into the object, like flowing the pouring of warm oil back and forth between the object and the observer. And so right there we had from the outset the classic yoga practices of dharana, dhyan, and samadhi showing up among these musicians.
And yeah, and I believe, and the thing with dhyan is also that the object being observed changes by virtue of the action of the observation, which is what then seems to be that step that is taken closer toward that unitive state. Whereas you were saying, Sat Bir, the performer, the instrument, and the space itself all become one. It's like the example you gave. I mean, I don't want to do a spoiler alert on Stephen's book, but when you talk about Marianne, what was her last name?
Marianne Anderson.
Anderson, who was able to describe perfectly how the audience changed. I mean, everybody changed together as she was singing. It was I think in Europe as well as on the Lincoln Memorial, right?
Well, what we know is that these deep states of concentration actually have a field effect on the whole field around them.
Right.
So in my chapter on music, I talk about the way in which when musicians drop into these deep states of concentration, certain minds in the audience that are able to and prone to will be drawn into that same state. And this is called a field effect. And we saw it at Tanglewood. We used to call these Tanglewood moments, when there was a sense that the whole group was drawn into this profound sense of concentration.
Well, so let's not exactly change gears, but I want to put a pin in a couple of things that we've talked about here with regard to performance anxiety. I want to get back to that, especially with you, Sat Bir. But for now, I'm going to talk about the 30 million yoga practitioners in the United States alone. Let's call it 50 million or more around the world. Maybe it's 100. Do you know the number? Do you have any loose knowledge of a global number of yoga practitioners, Sat Bir? I'm wondering if you do.
I don't have a global number, but certainly in the U.S. we're at least at 50 million.
At least at 50 million. Okay, so I did not know that number. I thought it was 30, but hey, I mean, let's just go with 50 plus million. Do they know about? Are they being taught this information about dhyan and samadhi in their yoga classes? Let's talk about the pros and, well, the sort of mainstreaming of yoga lineage in the context of the pros and cons of lineage. I know that's a mouthful of a question, but I want to root the conversation in what we talked about, what we would talk about today. Like, is your average vinyasa yoga student walking around having experienced a unitive state?
So, yoga's become very popular in the U.S. It's growing exponentially. The last survey in 2017, showed that 14% of the population had practiced yoga. So it has become extremely popular. And the thing with anything becoming popular, it diversifies. And so we now have a wide range of what is called yoga being practiced in the U.S. And it goes from one extreme of just being physical postures and exercises. People show up, they sweat, there's no relaxation, there's no meditation, there's no breathing techniques, they're out the door at the end. And on the other extreme is traditional yoga, which is really focused on working towards spiritual development and growth internally through, especially through the meditative practices within yoga. So you have this wide range. So there's a substantial fraction, we don't know the statistics on this, but there's a substantial fraction of the yoga that's being practiced in the US that really has nothing to do with these deeper experiences. And so they don't get philosophy and they don't get talk about these unitive states. It's all about the physical postures and the sweating and you know, to be a little derogatory about it, I call it butt slimming yoga. You know, that's the focus.
Yeah.
And so
I
we
mean,
have
there
this full
was a
range.
trademarked yoga butt for a while. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah. So there is a wide range of experiences, and so a lot of people practicing yoga have no idea about these deeper philosophical and even physiological and psychological aspects of yoga practice.
I think that's true and definitely my experience. So I went from living in an ashram for decades where all of these ideas and practices were understood deeply to living now here in Albany, where I live, Albany, New York. And now I'm in a community yoga center. It's fascinating. It's a big, extremely successful group of studios. We have 6 studios now, and it's high yoga, it's vinyasa, it's fantastic. The teachers are routinely wonderful, but there is absolutely no understanding of Dharma, Dhyana, and Samadhi, or the 8 limbs, even in a very superficial way. And I would have to say, Kim, that people definitely have these experiences of heightened, concentrated, absorptive states, and they realize that they're very pleasant and they're compelled to come back, but they don't have a name for it. They don't have an understanding of the greater context of what it is they're doing. And I think I'm not quite in the heartland. I was just in Ohio on my book tour, and I taught at a few yoga studios, and that was my impression there as well. I think it's, as Sat Bir said, we don't have numbers, but I think for the most part, it's maybe not quite butt slimming yoga, but the deeper context is pretty much not there.
yeah, I've recently moved, not to the heartland, but to the West, from the East Coast, and to offer my own small experience. I went to a yoga studio. A friend came to visit last week, and the studio, well, the studio is called a name that we've already used, a Sanskrit name. I'm not going to do it because I don't want to call them out. I honor what they're doing. I do, but it's an elevated name and it's a Sanskrit name, and so. We were there, I was, paying to go into the class, and the woman, a yoga practitioner behind the desk, was talking to my friend. They were sort of jawboning over being both from New York or something like that. And the woman behind the desk said, yeah, I was drinking so much this weekend that my accent, from New York came out. And it was a moment where I was like, God, it's so crazy that here we are about to go into this practice that is all about connecting and essentially sobering up. And the one thing that the first thing I find out about this person is that she spent time binge drinking over the weekend. I just felt so sad because it felt like, at least as I prepare for these conversations every month and I get to meet and spend time with you all who've, spent so much time in this practice. And I've spent, more than 30 years practicing, but 20 years teaching now. I just kind of, it's like I keep hearing that and I'm like, whoa, this is really present in the yoga space. Like the relaxation of drinking, is associated with the relaxation of practicing yoga. And what a perverse conflation, right?
I have an interesting sidebar on that, Kim, which is that when we were doing our work at Tanglewood, we were teaching the practices. We were teaching hatha yoga and we were teaching meditation, sitting meditation every morning. We taught a little bit, like I said, I taught the Bhagavad Gita. We taught a little basics about grasping and aversion and so forth. We discovered that simply over the course of 8 to 10 weeks, the students, as they began to get more connected with their own bodies and the feedback of their bodies, began modifying their diets and the way they drank, because it was a group that was fairly hard drinking. And they discovered that the feedback that you get from being in your body in an intense way in yoga makes you realize how not pleasant a drunken state is.
Totally.
They started changing the way they ate. So they ate less heavy foods. So this is very quickly self-correcting when you actually have some kind of deep yoga practice.
Yeah, and I see Sabir shaking his head because I wonder if this is like a check we put in the box of like pro lineage, because lineage practices can teach you some of this. I don't know if that's where you're going, Sabir, but please.
No, it's true. I mean, there's a lot to be said about the negative manifestations of yoga, and it's appeared in the West. I mean, we have beer yoga, wine yoga, goat yoga, and I spend a lot of time traveling to India, with my yoga research colleagues there, and when I run into Indians, I mean, they are aghast. They are like, "Oh, you Americans, you're taking our sacred yoga lineage and you're turning it into this, total, absolute, wasted
Party.
version
Party.
of yoga. What are you people doing? You're destroying yoga." And I understand and I appreciate that. But however, there's another side to that argument, and I actually made this argument with an editorial I wrote to the International Journal of Yoga Therapy some 10 years ago. And the idea was here that, yes, it's true. There is a lot of yoga that is very trivial, that is just physically oriented. But there's something about these physical postures and exercises, even though that's all they're doing, that engenders a change. And that change is a mind-body change that generates this deeper experience, this deeper sense of relaxation, a sense of connectedness. And suddenly, people are starting to question the yoga they're doing. They're saying, geez, this deeper experience is more than the reason I started, which was to fix my knee or to fix my shoulder or to reduce my stress. But now I want this deeper stuff, and this limited yoga doesn't seem to be getting me much further. So I'm going across the street to that yoga lineage style of yoga where they're talking about spirituality and get deeper into that. And so in that sense, these trivial forms of yoga can actually serve as a gateway to the more traditional lineages where you get this deeper experience and the discussion of the philosophy and the experience. And we're seeing this also in the research. There's a number of surveys that have been done of long-term yoga practitioners. And what they did in this survey, and there are several surveys, they asked initially, what were your initial reasons for beginning yoga practice? And, it was exercise and physical fitness right up at the top, and stress was a big one. And spirituality was way down there. It's like 5% of the population. And then they asked, what are your reasons for continuing yoga practice? And spirituality went way, 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 way up. And so that is evidence of this whole idea of the physical postures and exercises actually being a gateway. So what Stephen was just saying about this transition happening, it does happen that way. That when you practice this long enough, you get these deeper experiences, and that becomes your reason for continuing the practice and your goal in continuing the practice, in fact.
Let me add to that, Satbir. My 30 years at Kripalu showed me that so many of the people who came to Kripalu were living in a profound sense of alienation from their bodies and from their internal worlds. And even though, especially in the yoga lineages and so forth, and in India, certainly with your colleagues, so much of the dialogue is about transcendence and the beautiful esoteric parts of yoga. I found that for many of the students we saw at Kripalu, they had to add in the basic building block of connection with the body, the breath, the inner world. And so very often you'd see people come back over the course of years before they were actually ready, until they'd established what we call the witness, the observer, just that the small seed of the observer, and were really ready to drop down deeper into the deeper practices.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback on that, because if you presented a lot of people who are, going into the sort of the more trivial, what I call limited yoga forms, if you presented those individuals with this more traditional style that had all these components, they'd run away from you as fast as they could. They don't want that stuff. They're not there for that.
Yeah.
And so that's the beauty of this, is that you're giving them what they can attach onto and what they can accept, and then ultimately that leads to this deeper change and sense of searching for a deeper life purpose and meaning through these practices.
Exactly. And speaking as a psychologist now, I'll say that one of the things we discover at Kripalu is that people in our culture have not been safely held and soothed enough, not been contained enough. In order to have this deeper connection with the internal world and with body, breath, mental states, and all the rest of it, you have to have had a developmental phase in which you had enough safe psychic space to go in there. And so when you provide people with safe psychic space, that's Winnicott's term, and he says basically every developmental moment in the human being's life requires a period of time in that container, that safe psychic space. When you put people into that, as we did at Kripalu, because our motto at Kripalu is to create safe and sacred space. That's what we do. And within that, people begin to very spontaneously connect with unfinished developmental places, with anxious attachment disorders, with, Sat Bir talks about anxiety, with avoidant attachment disorders. All of that material begins to come up, and it's not necessarily what the contemplative traditions are best at. Sigmund Freud famously said, psychoanalysis is to help the patient leave neurotic misery and return to ordinary unhappiness. Leave neurotic misery. Our psychologies tend to be pretty good at relieving neurotic misery, just as Freud said. The contemplative traditions are brilliant at ordinary unhappiness, which you can start investigating after you deal with some of the neurotic, the more serious stuff inside.
I just want to tease that out just a bit. You said that our psychologies are very good at this neurotic unhappiness. Is that what I heard? But the contemplative traditions, you said, are good at dealing with and sort of managing ordinary unhappiness. Tell me, where does yoga sit in that? And the sort of embedded question in there is that I really believe that you put on the map this conversation in the United States, if not now globally, that yoga is this place to go into the psychology of the self and therefore to the freedom of the soul. Absolutely. My experience of Eastern traditions is, as you say, they're very good at this transcendent up and out focus. But now, thanks to your first book, I may not have been the first, but certainly the one that, Yoga and the Quest for the True Self, taught at least me and everybody I know, as yoga teachers, that safe psychic space and path of going in and relieving oneself of these disorders you discussed and these more unsafe, sort of fight or flight responses that we, for all intents and purposes, have had to the world.
Well, Kim, this is the genius of yoga in America right now.
We're
really bringing psychology and neuroscience and adapting many of the brilliant practices of yoga to these inquiries. And by the way, one of the great movements in the last 15 years has been the awakening of this whole field of positive psychology, which came from connection to the Eastern contemplative traditions. But we are we are very much on the forefront of integrating these ancient techniques for use in our culture, where there is more of the development of the subjective self, of the personal self, you might say, whereas traditional societies tend to see the self as embedded in social culture.
Mhm.
We have this whole expectation of developing this huge personal self. You know, and Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, the great crazy wisdom guru, used to say, it's like we have a big house and we have to clean it out. But once we clean it out, it's a huge space for God. So I think that we're in a very creative moment with the yoga traditions, and Sat Bir is on the cutting edge of that.
Oh, for sure. There's so many questions I want to ask you, Sat Bir, or both of you, but is there something you wanted to say on the end of that, Sat Bir?
Yeah, I mean, I think the neuroscience here is really paralleling the philosophy. And that's what's really remarkable. We're coming to understand what it means to meditate. When you focus attention, when you engage the attention networks in the brain and the executive regions of the brain and the frontal lobe, we know now about the connections about that region of the brain quieting down the limbic system, the emotional brain, the stress response and emotion response systems. Furthermore, when you engage the attention networks, you start to develop self-regulation of your own thought processes. And ultimately, that leads to a state we call metacognition, the realization that we are not our thoughts, because we have then the ability to change our reactivity to our own thoughts, and we can even change our thought processes. And what we're also understanding is that most psychological disorders like depression, anxiety, etc., are really all about the thoughts that are going on. And when you quiet down those thoughts, the disorder goes away. This is the basis behind the most powerful and universal form of psychotherapy today, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. And meditation also generates this state of metacognition, which is the basic construct behind cognitive behavioral therapy. So we're really starting to understand how Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and what was talked about there in terms of self-regulation of thought processes has total relevance for the general population in terms of improving mood state, but also in terms of medicine in preventing these psychological disorders, and in fact also treating them. And we just published our trial of yoga for generalized anxiety disorder that was published in JAMA Psychiatry, showing that our intervention was almost as strong as cognitive behavioral therapy. So we're really coming to a scientific understanding of all the philosophy, and we can now talk in neuroscience language about how this is working.
And also to add to that, Sat Bir, if you look at some of the most intractable psychological issues, which are around trauma, we've found that so many of the techniques from these traditions go directly to the body, and that going directly to the body, as Bessel van der Kolk says in his great book, is a way in that avoids some of the traps of some of the mental traps, and in treating trauma, it's essential.
Yeah, and just to embellish on that, I mean, what really is underappreciated in all of these psychological conditions, whether it's trauma, depression, or anxiety, is the involvement of bodily experiences and sensations. This is ignored. These disorders are treated as mental disorders. They are not mental disorders, they're mind-body disorders. And when you start to work the body and the breath, you have impact on these disorders because they are not just mental conditions, they are mind-body conditions. So, we're seeing really, an outgrowth of research on what's called trauma-sensitive yoga, and showing that yoga interventions can have really curative effects on people who've had trauma for decades. And the beauty of the treatment is that they don't have to go through the narrative of the trauma. They practice the yoga, and then weeks and months later, the symptoms have abated. It's almost like magic.
Isn't that, I mean, Bessel got that going, right? Wasn't that was the, I mean, that's really the first third in his description of his methodology in The Body Keeps the Score, which is the book I just put out to the chat. Did he get that started really and name that? Like, I'm getting people into my clinic and they are doing the postures or doing the breath work and they're doing the movements without putting any words to why they came in, or
Exactly.
right?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's it.
Absolutely. Bessel was one of the first and most influential psychologists
Yep.
to say we have to go directly to the body. We could go directly to the body in a way that's really effective. I want to speak a little bit to a term Sat Bir raised, which is self-regulation. So one of the things we've done together is to go into schools at a number of different levels, from high school all the way through middle school and down. And we've discovered that there's a crisis of self-regulation. Kids don't learn how to manage their thoughts, feelings, emotions. There's no place in those curricula where they learn that. And this is coming home to roost right now in our culture in general, because what you see around, say, January the 6th, and what you see all over the country is this lack of self-regulation, the lack of the capacity to manage difficult states, to move the conversation, if you will, from the limbic brain to the prefrontal cortex and make some connections there. And we found that kids at the high school level and the middle school level responded very well and very quickly to these self-regulatory techniques, to the point that they needed them so badly. They were teaching them to each other in the hallways. In one of our flagship schools, they took the detention room and turned it into a yoga room. And the kids realized that they could go in there and have quiet space and talk through their problems and begin to learn how to self-regulate. So we're actually in a cultural crisis of self-regulation right now.
That's absolutely true. There is a crisis with our adolescents and children. Mental health problems are out of control. A study done not too long ago showed that the cumulative prevalence of a child having one DSM bona fide psychological condition over a period of from age 9 to 19 is 80%.
Oh.
So the mental health conditions are nearly universal. The National Youth Risk Behavior Survey in the U.S. showed that 17% of high school students had actively contemplated suicide. So these are really disturbing statistics, and what they're experiencing in adolescence goes to adulthood. This lack of self-regulation of stress and emotion ultimately manifests in the high burden of depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions in adulthood. That's also been established.
Well, and I apologize for recycling any sort of sort of experience of trauma or harm that we all went through as a nation, but like, on the very extreme end of that, you have Uvalde. You have this lack of self-regulation, whatever was going on there. And then all of a sudden there's an entire community decimated by a total lack of support on any level. I mean, again, I'm wading into, anyway, it just, if you just follow that line all the way to its most extreme result, you have what happened a few weeks ago, as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. That's what I mean by the cultural
right.
crisis.
Yeah, exactly.
You have people acting out.
Right.
You have people acting out, and it's becoming more and more acceptable in our political climate, for example,
Totally.
for people to act rather than think and dialogue and move it to the prefrontal cortex. You have people.
And I want to anchor the conversation in a question. Sat Bir, this might be certainly more difficult for you to answer as a scientist, as a researcher, but to both of you, do you think, okay, what I'm hearing, and to summarize, like, especially the effects of these practices, like you mentioned techniques, Stephen, that, specific techniques that you were teaching these kids. So I'm interested in teasing that out a little bit, because if you connect, these musicians, these, older in a different place where performance anxiety, I mean, these were practitioners, these expert practitioners, expert performers, like we would call, as we talked about in our pre-call, expert yoga teachers. Okay, so we're talking about people that are just, experts in their field. Then you're talking about children, high school, middle school, grade school, experiencing techniques and experiencing these profound results from those techniques. Do you think that the postures really matter so much, given that the postures, whatever they are from whatever lineage. I mean, I'm thinking like if the Iyengars came in, they would be like triangle pose, mer. And, I'm not sure, the Kundalini people would say, I don't know the name of the pose, but I'm higher. So there's just so many different ways to do it. But is it the breath and is it the breath? Is that the difference? And do the postures matter?
So I would say yes. I mean, there's a whole parallel world of meditation in schools, and it's a strong movement, and there's positive benefit from kids in schools practicing meditation.
Mm.
Now, I think yoga is meditation plus,
Right.
because adding the breath helps, adding the postures helps. There's two sides to this. One is to actually reduce the stress and emotional disturbance. And the postures and the breathing are very powerful in helping with that on the physical level. And they also make changes in the central nervous system, especially slow breathing has direct impacts on pain regulation, emotion regulation in the central nervous system. The tie between emotion and breath is very tight. And one of the anecdotes we get from kids right away in our studies with yoga in schools is they're doing the breathing practices the next day after their first ever yoga class. They're doing it before an exam and they're finding that it helps them. So really, I think that adding all of these practices together in yoga is going to lead ultimately to stronger outcomes than if you practice just breathing or just meditation or just postures.
And that's the wisdom of Patanjali, because Patanjali in the systematic 8-stage path sees asana as a preparation for meditation. We're such a restless culture. We're so restless and we're so overstimulated that, as Sat Bir says, and as we both said, those direct interventions into states of hyperarousal are much easier and so more effective than trying to get kids to sit down and meditate. Now, kids will sit down and meditate, but it helps if they've done some yoga postures first.
Well, and I'll say that I think, again, I'm here, I'm sort of giving, the only thing I can do is give my small examples, to you greats. But, I think about my daughter during COVID, during lockdown, and watching her absolutely, I mean, the life force just drained out of her over the course of an entire year, logging into the computer because she's a kinetic learner. She likes to be in person with people. When she ever was given the choice, like, do this thing online or print the thing out and write it down, 100% of the time, just to touch the paper, just to get up and go to the printer, that's what she would choose to do. So if you sat her down and had her meditate, that would not be as effective an intervention, I would suggest, because she would want to and benefit from moving, as you said, Sat Bir, in this meditation plus format, which I really like the branding of, I have to say. So let's talk about the yoga class itself. And the idea, as we were discussing, sort of the pros and cons of yoga lineages, because I'm thinking a lot about, Stephen, what we were discussing before, the sort of genius of yoga in America, helping people be in a safe space. And let's tease that out and say in community, in a yoga class, the space and the class being held and instructed by a teacher. Can a teacher who has trained for 200 hours and practiced for a year hold a safe space compared with a teacher who's practiced over 10,000 hours and taught that many classes? Let's talk a little bit about this potential, these levels of transformation that can happen, are happening in yoga classes, and how we can talk about the value of yoga lineage or the problematic aspect of yoga lineage in these safe spaces.
Well, first of all, I would just say I'm a huge advocate of group practice, both in meditation and in yoga. There's a certain group energy that develops in either a yoga class, or I sit in a group 3 times a week. And, one of the things we know psychologically is that we learn to be alone with ourselves in the first instance only by being alone in the presence of a trusted other, right? So your dog is sitting next to you right now. Why? Because you're a trusted other. Why? Because he feels safe there. So we learn to be alone by being alone with ourselves in the presence of a safe container. And hopefully that's what a meditation group or a yoga class is. I came from a yoga class just now. I'm lying on my mat, it's a very gentle class. I'm very much deeply involved in my own internal process and my world, memories, thoughts, but I feel safe and soothed and contained by the fact that my friends are around me, my teacher whom I know is there, the music is soothing. There is there are a lot of technical reasons why classes, group practice matters, and I've been practicing solo on my living room floor for 2 years, and I'm so happy to be back and to feel that container that, I've talked about it as safe psychic space.
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's both biology and philosophy here. And the biology is very simple, that we are social animals, period. That's the way we are wired. We are social animals. And we haven't done a lot of research on the social impact of, practicing yoga in a group setting or in a private setting. But I can tell you from my experience of 45 years of living in a yoga community that it's very powerful when you practice in a group, and it's palpable, it's experiential, it's there. We just haven't had a lot of research on it yet. And so that's a very clear phenomenon, that we are. And then from the philosophical perspective, I mean, you go back into the writings, regardless of the spiritual tradition, and the idea is that if you want to go on the contemplative path, you seek the company of the holy. And that's the whole idea of living in spiritual community, because it facilitates that spiritual development. The personal interaction of working together with people of like minds who are also, geared and focusing on that contemplative practice as a goal in life is very, very supportive. And that's why we have ashrams and monasteries, because these are places that can really facilitate spiritual growth in a powerful way.
The Buddha said something so interesting. His most important disciple, Ananda, asked him, Ananda says, Lord, is spiritual friendship an important part of the spiritual path? And the Buddha says, no, Ananda, it's the whole of the spiritual path. It's the whole of the spiritual path. So spiritual friendship in community, sangha. Sat Bir says our spirits are social as well in a strange way. We want to be with other kind, growing human beings, yeah.
Totally. I'm so taken by all of this. Oh yes, Doug, I almost forgot my question, because I was thinking about the crisis of, well, I want to make sure I say this correctly. You said, a crisis of self-regulation in the country, right, Stephen? That was the phrase you used.
Yeah.
And I think, sort of a component of that, or a sort of like alongside that, is this crisis of loneliness. That there's so much lonely. I mean, we have the science on that the science of loneliness is more devastating to the longevity of the human being than even smoking. How much cigarettes a day? Did you guys read that the former Surgeon General of the US, oh Lord have mercy, what's his name? We've
Vivek Murthy.
Vivek Murthy, yeah, either was part of that study or he certainly has been cycling that around. It's like half a pack of cigarettes a day kills you just as quickly as the profound loneliness that you may be experiencing. How intense is that? And so in terms of the ashram community, we talked a little bit about that in our pre-call. You've both lived on ashrams for a long time. I didn't live there for a long time, but my first training was in an ashram, and I, went whole hog all in. And it's hard. I can't imagine my yoga teaching without it as the seed, that started my path 20 years ago. So today, 2022, after this unbelievable amount of isolation that so many people have gone through, the mainstream of yoga, 50 million or more people doing yoga who, would they know what an ashram was? Would they be able to define it? So what's the role of the ashram in today's yoga culture in your mind? What's the history of it? Maybe what is it today? And what are we doing in your perspective? Stephen, you talked about this 6-studio, kind of business, in Albany. What are studios doing to be sanghas? And I won't say ashrams, but are there any ashram-like qualities of yoga studios that can benefit students? So the history, the relevance of ashrams today, and what yoga studios are in this narrative.
Well, let me start tackling that. So Max Weber, great German philosopher and student of religion and spirituality, wrote that in order for a wisdom tradition to thrive and grow, there has to be somewhere a body of human beings who are practicing the highest aspirations of that wisdom tradition. And that's like the laboratory in which the aspirations and the outcomes can be shown. And I know that wisdom traditions die unless they have that kind of life. When I got to Kripalu 32 years ago, there was a renunciate group at the center of the ashram. They wore, saffron. They had a whole separate schedule. That was the kind of monastic group in the center of this wider group of sadhaks at Kripalu. And without that, the tradition begins to lose its juice, right? So the role of ashrams and the role of intentional spiritual communities where these lineages and these wisdom traditions are being practiced, I think is essential as the kind of lifeblood of a wisdom tradition. I don't know what you think, but Sat Bir.
Well, I guess it's a matter of degree of where people want to practice. Do people want to practice asanas? Do they want to practice yoga for spiritual development, or do they want to really engage in a yoga lifestyle? And I think it's a range, and different people need different things or have different goals in life. And so for academic institutions, we have universities, we have centers where academic activity is fostered and promoted, and learning at that level is taking place. We have lower levels of colleges where there's just teaching but no research. And then we have just the general population who might read on science. So we have this whole range. And I think we have the same in yoga. We have the option of an asana class. We have the option of a traditional yoga class. And there are still options for the deeper experiences. And one of the things that's come out over the past 3-4 decades has been the appearance of these retreats. You can go on a yoga retreat and get that experience for a week or so. So there's a middle ground there, but there are still ashrams and there are still spiritual communities that still live together and engage in more intensive regular practices.
I have a couple things to say to this. First of all, again, with my psychologist hat on, not only do we have a crisis of self-regulation, but we have a crisis of belonging. We have a crisis of belonging. One of the deepest needs of the human being is to belong and to feel reassured that we really do belong. And, in our virtual world where we're not connecting live and so forth, there's this crisis of belonging. So you end up with people who, in the absence of belonging to anything, decide they're going to belong to a tribe, with negative outcomes, but because that gives them a sense of belonging. So one of the things that happened for me at Kripalu I found in the ashram setting that it was peopled primarily by sadhaks who were looking at some level for the reparative family experience. So a lot of us had grown up in families where there was anxious attachment or avoidant attachment or disorganized attachment. A lot of us were longing for what happens when you belong for a period of time to a group that is practicing its aspirations, and within that, again, safe psychic space, begin to connect with, whatever your soul's longing is. Now, most of the ashram training actually addresses, I would say, higher levels of human development that may begin with what I would call the existential. Existential is where you're breaking out of just personal identity and looking for something bigger. You're asking existential questions. What about death? What is life for? What is the purpose of life? That's kind of the springboard for truly using these great traditions that yoga gives us.
So so you're saying that ashrams then are the place, and to a lesser degree, and that's what I was expecting us to sort of say, that there's like degrees of absorption, basically, like a week-long retreat might offer, or a month-long, kind of residential program might offer at an ashram. I mean, there's just a lot of different degrees, I guess. I suppose I'm wondering, now that we're post-COVID, and it's just interesting that this yoga lineage, this conversation, as you and I talked, Stephen, seems to be getting some fire underneath it, at least for those of us discussing it, because it seems to me it's important to put a pin in what the channels are for 45 of the 50 million yoga practitioners who don't know about this, or would, sit in on a conversation like this one and go, whoa, like, what's a sadhak, and yoga and Bhagavad Gita and like Yoga Sutras, who just basically had not had exposure to that. Like, do you think that there's enough in the yoga ashram community and enough of these conversations, and again, above the 10,000 hour studied practitioner and teacher, to have some impact and some influence in the yoga world? I guess the reason I'm asking is because I myself feel a little bit like the wheels are like off the tracks, where there's so much desolation, so much desperation, and so much suffering right now. How can yoga get to people and really help start to cool and calm and make safer these nervous systems in the context of whatever the yoga practice is, class, retreat, ashram, whatever?
Yeah, I think you can definitely create community at the yoga studio level. So I just, as I said, came back from Ohio, and I spoke at a number of different studios, but I hit one that had all the signs of, this is a real community. This is thriving. This is where people are hungry to hear about the deeper scriptures of yoga. And I could feel the skillfulness of the people who run the studio in creating sangha and creating regular satsang, which means the gathering for spiritual expression. And it's definitely possible if you have a mature leader who understands what's possible at that community level.
Yeah, I think the yoga world needs some leaders. I really do. I think one of the things we're looking for right now is some leaders to.
So this is a topic that's very much on my mind, is that we lack overall in the yoga world a real strong leadership body.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of disparate lineages and a lot of disparate groups that are practicing yoga, but there's not much connection and there's not much leadership in that sense. And we have a lot to do to educate the public about the practice of yoga that can change their perception. Because on the one extreme, there's this perception of yoga that it's a bendy thing that only women practice and you have to be wealthy. And so therefore I'm an elderly person, or an adolescent, or I have a disorder, and therefore I don't fit that category, therefore yoga is not for me. And that's a misconception, because we know yoga can be applied to virtually any population regardless of their limitations. And on the other extreme, there's this, oh, yoga is part of Hinduism. It's a religion. If you practice yoga, you're going to turn into a Hindu. And that's false as well, because yoga is a mind-body practice, and it's not belief-based. It's not a religion. So we have a lot of education to do to exert that kind of leadership, to bring the virtue of yoga into society, to really address this epidemic of the lack of self-care, which is manifesting in high levels of mental health problems and chronic stress. So, and one of the examples I like to look at where they do have stronger leadership is in the field of mindfulness meditation. So, for example, the Mind and Life Institute is a very strong organization that promotes, the practice of mindfulness. They hold a conference, they do education, and they have strong proponents, including the Dalai Lama, Richie Davidson, John Kabat-Zinn. And mindfulness, as a consequence, has become really international. It's actually taken over the field of clinical psychology. There's not a clinical psychologist these days who's not implementing mindfulness practices. And we need that same kind of leadership in yoga. And how to get there is really the question.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead. I've got a couple questions, but Stephen, please.
Well, I was just going to say, for a number of years at Kripalu, we had gatherings of the major lineages in America, and we did one 5-year series of bringing Buddhists and yogis together, and one just bringing the heads of yoga lineages together. And it was very interesting to see how much sectarianism there is in the yoga world. It surprised me, honestly. There are two forms of grasping. One is reaching and the other is protecting. There was a lot of protecting my sacred space. I've got a better lineage than you. I've got the right way to go. And that begins to get a little cultish. So it's been quite a few years since we had those series for 5 years of conversations called Yoga at the Leading Edge. But I hope that we're beginning to break down some of those sectarian barriers. It reminded me of my boyhood in Protestantism, where if you were a Baptist, you crossed the street if the Catholics came by.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. And if you were like a, Baptist, you were definitely worshiping differently than a Methodist, and an Episcopalian was, it's like, at least that was how we, and then, and forget about it, the Jewish, the Muslim, all right, forget it. Yeah. And so, Stephen, the first time you and I spoke, and, this is my driving kind of inspiration behind this series, is that I believe that we are in a century where the silos of sectarianism no longer have the same structure. They're flimsier now. They're starting to, I call it there's holes in the corn silos, and corn's starting to come out, and their silos are starting to sort of see that they're, first of all, next to each other, secondly, holding the same things, and thirdly, there's power in numbers. And so why not all get together and talk about these, Sat Bir, that's why, it's so brilliant that you bring what you bring to the yoga conversation, because the straight up researched efficacy of yoga techniques and practices are right there. Like, you can read them, you can understand them, and what, of course, my dear friend and colleague Andreas Engel and I are sort of talking about, working on, is doing these, taking this into actionable, making that stuff actionable for yoga teachers and for yoga practitioners. So the question, so I couldn't agree with you more, Amy, who says, thanks so much for being here. It's a privilege to listen. Stephen, I've read the great work of your life and yoga trainings with Happy Jack Yoga. I'm also a classical pianist, so appreciate all of your work. Sat Bir Jack Boken, aka Happy Jack, is also attending Harvard this fall, although the divinity school, not medical school. So maybe you have met him or you will. I wish I had known about your music performance anxiety work when I attended Oberlin Conservatory. Oh, wonderful. Oh, yeah, for piano. I will likely have many questions as we get into this webinar, but maybe it sounds like you may have answered a lot because we haven't heard from Amy since. Quick question, I would say to Deborah, who's just also chatted in about an edition of the Gita that you recommend. I have to, pardon me for stepping in and saying, Deb, you should read the Dharma in difficult times first, and then go read whatever Stephen says to read of the Gita, because it is such a beautiful, creative, relevant read of the Gita, what you wrote, Stephen. I mean, it's amazing. So the Dharma in difficult times, but does either of you have, she says she's already ordered it. I told
that's great. Yay, good for you.
Yeah.
Well, no, I always recommend Eknath Eswaran's work. He translated himself from India to UCLA and really understands the Western psyche. His commentaries and translations are brilliant, beautiful, really accessible. So his work on the Gita is where I would start for a Western mind.
Great. Do you have
But I wanted to say something about sectarianism, because there's a huge paradox here, which is that in India, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Sat Bir, but there's a history of tremendous pluralism, of religious pluralism. And, I've studied a lot about Gandhi, and I've written a number of chapters in my books about Gandhi, who was intensely pluralist, and, read the Bible and read Tolstoy and, read all of the great yoga scriptures and read into Buddhism. So there's a tradition of very, very beautiful pluralism in India that we should begin to replicate a little bit here.
Yeah, and I've experienced that the sectarianism that we see here in the West, which is, typified by my yoga will lead to a higher plane of consciousness than your yoga will, it is much less there in India. And so very different yoga traditions will coexist, quite fine with each other. And I think that's great, and that's a strength. But it's part of human nature to become that way to some degree. I mean, you have a favorite sports teams, and your sports team is the best, and that's the one that's got to win, and the other one should not. So I mean, it's part of human nature in a way, and it's the thing that will interfere with trying to develop some kind of leadership body for yoga. That's the challenge. But there is a commonality, and the commonality is that we have these postures, we have these breathing techniques, we have these relaxation practices, we have these meditation practices, and we have this philosophy, and that is common to yoga in general. And so I think if we stand behind that in some kind of leadership organization, that would be great.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and that's what a leader does, is to recognize that I should have made this analogy earlier, but it's the corn, it's not the silos, right? The silos are just holding the same thing, and it's just a matter of what's on the outside, really. And that's, again, I think where the science that you're bringing, Sat Bir, is so important, because it's, again, right there, sort of irrefutable in front of you, having been looked at.
I agree. And I just want to say that the conferences that Sat Bir and his gang run are places where that kind of sectarianism does not manifest much at all. I've never seen it there. So there is a way in which your work, Sat Bir, is neutral and accessible to everybody.
Yeah.
So you may be one of the linchpins of a structure, a national or international structure.
Right. And I would say that if Sat Bir is neutral in this way, to use that word, Stephen, then you are, can you make kairos like kairotic? I mean, like you're alchemical in this way because of your ability to name the transition that yoga over these, thousands of years is now making into the West, into people, into this safe psychic space of transformation. So I would say that you both are doing like critical work in transforming and elevating the yoga practice and conversation in this country.
Thank
Is there
you.
anything last you'd like to say before we end? Again, I could go on and on and on, but we've just got about a minute left.
Well, I would just say I'm very interested in the more transformational aspects of yoga. I've written a lot about the Yoga Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita. And look, I'm 73 years old. And at my age, you really begin to ask those existential questions quite with a certain amount of seriousness. So I'm very interested in the questions about what's possible for a human being. Who can we be? What if we're working on all cylinders? So, you know, the traditions primarily focus on suffering and the end of suffering, and the aspiration, who can we be as human beings? And this is where the yoga tradition has beautiful and very real aspirations.
Mm-hmm. And we're translating them into English, aren't we?
We are. That's what I do.
Yeah.
Like, how do I translate the Gita in a way that makes any difference at all to people, or the even more difficult Yoga Sutra?
Totally. Well, please don't stop, and please let us continue to support both of you and all of your work. It's just such an honor to spend time with you in this space. And to those of you on the call, still, we have always ask a questionnaire at the end. How did we do? What more would you like to see? Give us any feedback at all. We'd love to know what more you'd like to see. Please tune in for Pritpal Khalsa, who will come in with Joan White in just a few weeks, the second week of July. I think it's July the 6th, to talk about Iyengar yoga and Kundalini yoga together as women. We'll be talking about being women practitioners in these also the many years that the two of them have devoted to their gurus and to their practices. So that's the next installation of Yoga Lineages. We have Barbara Baina coming in September, and Doug Keller coming in, maybe with her, but also maybe in October. But that's what we have coming up. And somebody tell Richard Freeman to email me back. He said he would come in, but now I can't get to him. So somebody tell him I said hi.
He's off on a mountaintop meditating.
I know. Well, I'm right at that mountain. I think I'm about to drive to the mountaintop. I think that's what I'm his neighbor now. Thank you guys so much. Thank you so much. Thanks to the audience, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye-bye. Namaste.
Bye.